or rather in subject formation. It's very important in the politics of a people. It's very important in the struggles of a people. And mostly in the post-colonial discourse, people have normally ignored that part, the part of religion and its role in shaping the struggles of the people against colonialism. And the Igbo belief system, of course, was very central in the expression of colonial resistance. And what is religious extremism? I'll give some definitions here. So definitely, I am going into this because there is increased visibility of religious extremism in conflicts and politics of Africa. And we do have the Boko Haram currently in Nigeria, and its neighboring countries, that is Mali, Cameroon, and of course Chad, and Achebe in Somalia, and its neighbors also, including Kenya, and I'm from Kenya. And radicalization here will define as adoption or promotion of an extreme belief system for the purpose of facilitating ideological-based violence to advance political, religious, or social change. I define religious violent extremism that when I will explain it as when radicalized people or groups invoke a system of beliefs to engage in or justify acts of violence against governments or other people for the advancement of their political and social systems and their ideologies. So there are generally two main factors of violent extremism that are of course intertwined. They are what we call the pull factors, the individual reasons to join violent extremism, which one is in defining the individual reasons. It could be because of an appeal to a political leader. This is mostly a charismatic leader who uses mostly local languages, portray the target communities as victims, and creates a central ideology. And other reasons are economic, that could pull somebody to violent extremism, are economic or emotional benefits that a person may get by joining a terrorist group. And also, that goes sometimes and mostly with a feeling of religious obligation. And there are also push factors, factors within the society that make somebody be attracted to violent extremism. And those are social, political, and economic. It could be denial of basic political rights and liberties. It could be gross misconduct and denial of basic human rights, foreign domination, and not necessarily physical domination as it was during the colonial period. It could be also like the arguments that most terrorist groups will have that there is some Western influence, although right now the European countries are not in those countries like Middle East and Africa. And it could be also because of socioeconomic reasons. So definitely, I know we have mentioned this, but I will, and most of us are of course aware because most of us have gone through things fall apart, but I will quickly mention the main pillars of religion or the traditional religion in Igbo. There is obviously the belief of Chukwu, or the supreme God. And we see this also through the arguments between Akuna and Mr. Brown. And then the other small gods or other deities like Ani, Ifejioko, I'm not sure whether I'm pronouncing them right, Amadiora, Igwe, Idemili, and Ogugu. And then there is also the personal god, Chi, and sorrow spirits. And we obviously know the importance of this, of the belief system, because Umofia never went to war unless its case was clear and was accepted as such by the Oracle of the Hills of the Cave, Agbala. And Agbala was in a cave accessed through a hollow path. No one had ever beheld Agbala except the priestess. So we see a belief system that is equivalent to most of the religious beliefs that we have in the world, such as Christianity and Islam. And we also have priestess, and such as Chielo, who greeted our God with a multitude of names. And we all know that we call our gods with a multitude of names too in the other religions. The honor of the future, the messenger of earth, the one who cut a man down when life was sweetest to him. All these are phrases that we use in the other religions, Islam and Christianity. And then there is also prayer. Agbala was consulted by Unoka when he had low harvest, was consulted when misfortune hit, or when there was dispute with neighbors, was also consulted about the future and departed fathers. And during the feast of New Year, Okonko asked ancestors to protect him, his children, and their mothers in the New Year. So we see all these sorts of prayers that we do in the mainstream religions, Islam and Christianity. And then they also have prophets and sacrifice. And before planting, Unoka sacrificed a cock to Anu. He also kills a cock at the shrine of Ifejioko, the god of yams. Human sacrifice, which was the basis of people like Ngoye to be Christians. Egbefe then came in with a message that the oracle of the hills and caves had pronounced that Ikemafuna be killed. So the concept of sacrifice, when Okonko was received by his mother's kinsmen, Uchendo arranged the requisite rites and sacrifice for a female Ucho. And then we all know that in most religious societies, there is the religion and law are intertwined. So we also see this in the Igbo society, where we have a village was an autonomous polity. There were councils of elders, there were titled men, there was a court system. Okonko was fined after he beat his or justice system. Okonko was fined after he beat his wife. There is also cases in child custody. The case between Ozowolo and his wife, arbitrated by the spirit of the evil spirit. We see things being said during judgments like it is not bravery when a man fights with a woman. A neighbor who let his cows loose and ate crops was fined heavily, so there was also fine. If a person inadvertently killed another, it was considered a female crime and had to flee from the land. He could, more like manslaughter, he could return after 7 years. So, and then we have the beginning of colonialism, where now there is the introduction of Christianity. And it starts by the white man who went to Abame and was killed because the oracle said that the strange man would break their clan and spread destruction among them. The oracle also said that other white men were on their way, and they were locusts, and that the first man was a harbinger sent to explore the terrain, and so they killed him. So with the coming of these Europeans, there was also the introduction of Christianity and colonialism. And 2 years after Okonko's exile, Obiereka pays his friend a visit once he killed, and he was told to go to his mother's home. The missionaries had built a church at Omafia and had won a handful of converts. And also noticed that the new converts were the kind of people that people called efulefu, fool, idiots, worthless men with no titles. And I mention this because I see I relate to this because most of the the so-called terrorists are normally people who are recruited from the most disparate people of the society. These are mostly the less successful people in the society. And Chielo, the priestess of Agbala, called the new converts, in fact, excrement of the clan. And the new faith was a mad dog that had come to eat it up. So rejecting Christianity is ending. And then there were also those who rejected Christianity. And the main aim was to preserve the Igbo identity. And we see this discourse also in most terrorist groups, the discourse of purity, that there is need to maintain purity. And for example, Islam, that's the main argument with Boko Haram and of course also Al-Shabaab, that Islam should not be contaminated by other traditions or other cultures in any way. So, and another characteristics also of this group of extremism was also there must be mostly a charismatic leader. And we see this, at first there was Mr. Brown, who was very tolerant, and we didn't see any of these cases in Things Fall Apart, had debates, open debates with Igbo religion, on Igbo religion and Christianity with Akuna. And then we see Reverend John Smith, who took over from Brown and openly condemned Mr. Brown's policy of compromise and accommodation. He saw the world as a battlefield, that's what Akonka is telling us, in which, Chinua Achebe, in which the children of light were locked in a mortal conflict with the sons of darkness. So all this rhetoric, language, will obviously lead to conflict. And then Mr. Smith suspended a woman from church because she allowed the mutilation of the body of her dead child who was believed to be an Ogbanje. So we see all these now things coming in that have the picture of extremists. And then there was also disregard of the African traditions. The evangelist told the people of Banta that those who worshipped woods and stones will go to hellfire. And this is the same rhetoric that most leaders of terrorism would use, that you are either with us or you're not with us, and if you're not with us, you're definitely going to hell. You're not going to Jannah. You're not going to paradise. And the white man called the Gikuyu god Prince of Darkness also. We see this in Ngugi wa Thiong'o's The River Between, where the prince calls the Gikuyu god Prince of Darkness. And we all know what happened in The River Between, because when we see Joshua, who is the catechist or the Christian leader there, and then in opposition to that, we see the other force, the traditionalists, led by Kafonyi and Kamau, counteracting that, and the result was a major conflict between the two groups because of the two leaders who were intolerant. And some customs, of course, were barbaric and led to, this conflict being more, and we have twins thrown away. We have human sacrifice with the mutilation of dead children regarding Okwaje. We have Nyowe had also joined the new religion who did not like he did not like the throwing of twins and Ikemokuna's killing. So there are also those people who are against the traditional religion because of these extremist acts or acts that were seen as bad in the face of the Igbo traditions and cultures. And another thing that we also see that motivates violent extremism is a harsh and brutal administration. And we see this also, the colonial administration was of course harsh and brutal. Obiereka explains to Okongo in Mbanta how Abame was wiped out by white men. The missionaries did not only bring religion but also government, there was a government, and they built a place for judgment in Umofia to protect their followers. The DC, we are told, judged cases with ignorance, and most of the helpers of the DC were from Umoro, where the white man came first. And all this, we see like injustice that can obviously be a factor in bringing out violent extremism. So I will have to say, quickly go through this, one more slide. The white man built a court in Omofia, we have already mentioned that, and we also see that there are mass arrests. Whenever something small happens, we see mass arrests. Aneta was hanged by a white man, and there was the Egugu, 12 of them, who were handicapped. And they were taken to court, and they were fined 200 bags of cowrie for burning people's houses and the church. And in addition to that, there was another, I think 50 cowries, which was added by the courtman so that he gets something out of it. So acts of corruption, injustice, and fairness. And there's also the killing of the royal python by, who was, of course, the most revered animal, and it was called our father, by Enoch, I believe, who killed the royal python. So those are extremist acts instigated by the new priest. In retaliation, the Egu goes on burnt the church. And Enoch explicitly mentions a holy war. He said Enoch was disappointed in land that there would be no holy war after they amassed a Gugu. Okonkwo single-handedly, on the other side, wages a religious war against the missionaries and the colonial government, although he doesn't get followers. And he mourned the clan, which he saw breaking up and falling apart, and he mourned for the warlike men of Umuofia. So in conclusion, I will mention that a common characteristic across terrorist organizations is that they have leaders who are charismatic. We have, in the Al-Shabaab case, we can learn a lot from Okonkwo and the new reverend, who was very radical, and ideological differences that we see. So we had Abu Drogo and the Al-Shabaab in Kenya, who preached against the Kenya government, against Christianity, and against the Western culture. And his argument was that the government is very unfair to us. Generally, the Muslims are marginalized. So most of these people will take victimhood as their main subject. You are victims of the state. You are victims of the Western domination. So rise up. Muhammad Yusuf and Abubakar Shekau in Nigeria are other examples with the Boko Haram, who use the same discourse that you are victims of the Nigerian state. The northern people, the northern Muslims, have been generally ignored. And most of these people also know the local languages and the ways of the communities they live. And that's why we see people who know the community well as the most vocal. And they would use the local languages to their own advantage so that they can articulate the reasons as to why they want people to take arms very well. And there is also economic and political marginalization, just as the case with the Igbo society, which was suppressed economically. It was suppressed in so many ways. And those converts were the estimate of the clan, were the first converts and were hostile towards their own people. The system of justice established by the missionaries was, of course, very oppressive, and it led to violence against each other, and there was also indiscriminate mass arrests. All these are things we see in the modern terrorist or organizations. Thank you.
Okay. Let me first of all start by thanking the organization, the CIALF, for letting me crash your party, your intellectual party, as well as, of course, the great food that we've been enjoying. You see, I am neither in languages nor in literature. I'm just an ordinary historian. A historian who loves to hang around those who hang around the wordsmiths. But we all grew up, Chinua Achebe was like, we all grew up under the watchful eyes of Chinua Achebe, right? And hence that's what we meant by the conscience of a nation. And so when I heard that you guys are coming down here to discuss, in part, things fall apart, and of course Chinua Achebe, I'm like, well, I have to be part of it. All right, so my presentation is not really going to be on a literary critique of Achebe's work. I mean, you guys have spoken very eloquently on that. But it will focus on Achebe's political activism, using his writings and speeches and so many of them to explore his role as the conscience of the Nigerian state. For over 5 decades, Achebe remained indefatigable in his quest to shine light on the multitude of challenges facing his beloved but troubled home country, Nigeria. through his writings, fiction and non-fiction, his public lectures, commentaries, and interviews. Achebe vigorously engaged the subjects of ethnicity and corruption, the cult of mediocrity, social injustice, religious intolerance, as Mohammed just spoke about, and above all, abuse of power and poor leadership that have beleaguered post-colonial Nigeria. He publicly confronted Nigeria's leaders and, at least on one occasion, refused to accept the nation's highest award bestowed on him by the then President of the Republic. So in this paper, what I'm doing is to look at Achebe's activism over the years and attempt to use Achebe's case as a window to reflect on the unique roles of and responsibilities and challenges of African writers in nation building in post-colonial Africa. From his early days as a writer, Achebe was very clear on what he saw as the peculiar and particular roles African writers must play in their societies, which were then just emerging from years of European colonial rule. 6 years after the publication of Things Fall Apart, by which time Achebe had garnered considerable recognition as one of the pioneers of modern African literature, Achebe proclaimed that the African writer had a responsibility to stand up to defend the humanity of black people. At a time when, as he puts it, the full humanity of African people was being called into question, he declared, and I quote, "It's inconceivable to me that a serious writer could stand aside from this debate or be indifferent to this argument which calls his full humanity in question. For me, at any rate, there is a clear duty to make a statement." In that essay, appropriately titled Role of the Writer in a New Nation, Achebe insists that the very first role of African writers during that transition period, when their countries were emerging from colonial rule, was to lay to rest that century-old narrative that the benevolent Europeans brought light and civilization to the savage Africans. African writers must make it clear, Achebe insisted, that African peoples did not hear of culture for the first time from Europeans, that their societies were not mindless, but frequently had a philosophy of great depth and value and beauty, and that they had poetry, and above all, they had dignity. It's this dignity that many African peoples all but lost in the colonial period, and it is this dignity that they must now regain. The writer's duty is to help them regain it. Achebe will return to this theme throughout his long career in several writings, some of which will be published in his collection of essays and in countless keynote speeches all over the world, and numerous interviews that he granted. And we have touched on some of them. In the 1969 interview he granted to Bentley Foss, yeah, that's Bentley Foss you know, Ian Monroe, Richard Pribb, and Reinhard Sander, Achebe spoke of the connections between literature in early post-colonial Africa and social change and political messages. I believe it's impossible to write anything in Africa without some kind of commitment, some kind of message, some kind of protest. Even those early novels that looked like very gentle recreations of the past, what they were saying, in effect, was that we had a past. That was a protest because there were people who thought we did not have a past. One big message of the many that I try to put across is that Africa was not a vacuum before the coming of Europeans, that culture was not unknown in Africa, that culture was not brought to Africa by the white world. You would have thought it was obvious that everybody had a past, but there were people who came to Africa and said, you have no history, you have no civilization, you have no culture, you have no religion. You are lucky we are here. Well, we know we did not just drop from the sky. We too had our own history, traditions, cultures, civilizations. It's not possible for one culture to come to another and say, I am the truth, the way and the life. There is nothing else but me. If you say this, you are guilty of irreverence and arrogance. You are also stupid, and this really concerns me. The African writers, Achebe insisted over and over, cannot expect to be excused from the task of re-education of their people. Re-education that must be done to help the people regain belief in themselves and put away the complexes of years of denigration and self-abatement. I would be quite satisfied if my novels, especially the ones set in the past, do no more than teach my readers that their past, with all its imperfections, was not one long night of savagery from which the first Europeans, acting on God's behalf, delivered them. Well, but while he was vigorously advocating for the restoration of the dignity of the African, Achebe was also witnessing the destruction of those same newly minted post-colonial nations, this time in the hands of the same African nationalist politicians that fought for its independence. And the irony was not lost on him. He was dismayed at the corruption, abuse of power, and divisive politics of Nigeria's First Republic politicians. And in keeping with that responsibility of the writer and the conscience of the nation, he turned his pen, this time, on the African politicians. Here's how he explained it to Linfors and others then. We started off, and this was necessary, showing that there was something here, civilization, religion, history. Then we had to move on to the era of independence. Having fought with the nationalists and being on the side of the politicians, I realized after independence that they and I were now on different sides because they were not doing what we had agreed that they should do. So I had to become a critic. I found myself on the side of the people against their leaders, this time being black people. In his fourth book, A Man of the People, the political satire of the corruption, political violence, rampant electoral malpractice, and debauchery that Nigeria's First Republic became. Years later, reflecting on the circumstances that inspired him to write that book, Achebe said, within 6 years of independence, Nigeria was a cesspool of corruption and misrule. Public servants helped themselves freely to the nation's wealth. A certain professor has described the government of many African countries as kleptocracy. Nigeria could certainly be called that. Elections were blatantly rigged. One British weekly captioned its story of a Nigerian election, let's see if I can pronounce this, Nigerimandering. Nigerimandering. The national census was outrageously stage-managed. Judges and magistrates were manipulated by politicians in power. The politicians themselves were manipulated and corrupted by foreign business interests. This was the situation in which I wrote A Man of the People. And in a chilling prophetic ending in that book, the army staged a coup d'etat and locked up the corrupt politicians. Achebe finished the manuscript of that book in 1964-65, and the publisher Heinemann was set to release the book on January 17, 1966. On the morning of January 15, 1966, a group of revolutionary young officers of the Nigerian army staged a coup d'etat, real-life coup d'etat, and tried to purge the nation of those corrupt politicians. In his radio broadcast to the nation, the leader of the coup, Major Chukwuma Kaduna said, "Our enemies are the political profiteers, swindlers, men in high and low places that seek bribes and demand 10%, those that seek to keep the country permanently divided so that they can remain in office as ministers and VIPs of waste, the tribalists, the nepotists, those that make the country look big for nothing before international circles." Well, Nzogbu's coup and his vision did not succeed. The reactionary forces struck back. The establishment army chief, General Lagbe Ransi, crushed the coup, rounded up and locked the young coup plotters. The corrupt politicians were released from jail and let loose on the people once again. Lagbe Ransi himself became a dictator. 6 months later, he was killed in yet another coup d'etat. From then on, the country began to descend into chaos and absolute madness. Thousands of Igbo people were killed in northern Nigeria and Lagos in what was clearly a planned attempt at genocide. Achebe himself was almost a victim. He was only saved by a tipster who called him just in time for him to escape with his family and going to hide him in Lagos. They were looking for him to kill him. Then when it became clear that the central government of Nigeria and other regional governments were unable or unwilling to protect their Igbo citizens, the survivors of the massacres fled to their homeland in eastern Nigeria. They rallied behind their leader, Colonel Odumegwu, and proclaimed a breakaway nation of Biafra. When negotiations with the central government of Nigeria failed, war started in 1967. Nigeria, or more precisely Igbo land, will become the theater of the most vicious post-colonial war in Africa as at that time. Estimated 3 million people died by direct military attacks or by starvation by the time the war ended in 1970. Biafra lost. But meanwhile, Achebe, who had managed to flee to his hometown in eastern Nigeria with his family just before the war started, would work for Biafra as a roving ambassador and a spokesperson. He vigorously defended the Biafra struggle. In a 1968 speech he delivered at Makerere University in Uganda, he said, "Biafra stands in opposition to the murder and rape of Africa by whites and blacks alike, because she has tasted both and found them equally bitter. No government, black or white, has the right to stigmatize and destroy groups of its own citizens without undermining the basis of its existence. The government of Nigeria failed to protect the 14 million people of its former eastern Nigeria from wanton destruction and rightly lost their allegiance. Biafra stands for true independence in Africa," he continued, "for an end to the 400 years of shame and humiliation which we have suffered in our association with Europe. Britain knows this and is using Nigeria to destroy Biafra. I believe our cause is right and just, and this is what literature in Africa should be about, right and just cause." See, Achebe always finds a way to connect literature with his activism, right? When the war ended, he went to become a professor at the famed University of Nigeria in Nsukka and resumed his writing, which has somewhat been interrupted by the war. Let me speak briefly about post-war Nigeria, because he will also continue writing about Nigeria, right? Of course, he was disillusioned, Achebe was, at seeing the nation, Nigeria, that is so much loved and spent so much time defending its dignity, and seeing how Nigeria descended into chaos. But if he was disillusioned, he was not pessimistic. He told Ernest Emeano, yeah, that's Ernest Emeano that you know, in 1972, that post-independence Africa was not a hopeless case, in spite of all its problems. If you were convinced that it was absolutely hopeless, Achebe said, then you should just drink and wait for your death. But the fact that you are talking about it implies some optimism that there is still a possibility of change. So it's not entirely pessimistic. But the situation is bad, really bad. And one should not pretend that there is no problem when the place is full of problems. So one has to bring those problems out as forcefully as possible to draw attention to them. It has always been the method of teachers at all times to exaggerate in order to draw attention. That's a lesson from a great teacher, right? And forcefully he will do for the next 4 decades in shining light on those myriads of Africa's and Nigeria's problems, proffering solutions, even venturing into party politics, all the while holding out hope that someday the continent and the people will find their correct bearing. If a society is ill, the writer has a responsibility to point it out. Achebe proclaimed in his last book, There Was a Country, a memoir published just 1 year before he departed to join the ancestors. And he lived up to that responsibility. He never minced words in pointing out the numerous ills that plagued post-war Nigeria, especially the crisis of leadership the cult of mediocrity, corruption, economic inequality, social injustice, and tribalism. He sought to hold those responsible accountable, especially the military leadership, the politicians, and their sycophantic elite and intelligentsia enablers. In the opening sentence to his book, The Trouble with Nigeria, Achebe wrote in his characteristic candor, "The trouble with Nigeria is simply and squarely a failure of leadership. There is nothing basically wrong with the Nigerian character. There is nothing wrong with the Nigerian land or climate or water or anything else. The Nigerian problem is the unwillingness or inability of its leaders to rise to responsibility, to the challenge of personal example, which are hallmarks of true leadership." Just only 63 pages long, the book is a blistering indictment of the decadence, corruption, and ineptitude and incompetence of Nigeria's Second Republic, 1979 to 1983. And he wrote extensively about how the leaders of the country have squandered the wealth of the nation, stolen wealth which would have been used to build the nation. In a particularly bold move, Achebe took on the two sacred cows of Nigeria's nationalist and post-independence politics. Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe, the first president of independent Nigeria, and Chief Obafemi Awolowo, the powerful former premier of Western Nigeria, describing their return to partisan politics as, quote, unmitigated disaster for the nation. He argued that these two stalwarts of Nigeria's politics contributed immensely in the development of Nigeria's politics of tribalism and nepotism. You dare not criticize Zik or Awo in Nigeria, right? But Achebe did. And which helped to bring down the First Republic in 1966, and their return to politics in the Second Republic in 1979, these leaders had, according to Achebe, corrupted the younger leaders, the younger politicians, thereby entrapping and holding the nation. He concluded, "I have gone on to such length on Azikiwe and Chief Awolowo, not because I have anything against them personally, but because I believe quite strongly that if Nigeria is to avoid catastrophes of possibly greater dimension than we have been through since independence, we must take a hard and unsentimental look at the crucial question of leadership and political power. There is no doubt in my mind that the continued dominance of major areas of Nigerian politics by Azikiwe and Awolowo was of negative value, not because they are old men, but because their political thought, which is the mainspring of political action, was always, at the best of times, defective. Needless to tell you that the rabidly loyal supporters of both men did not take kindly to Achebe's attack on their gods. In 1988, the authorities of Lagos State University, Lagos State, not the University of Lagos, Lagos State University abruptly cancelled the university's commencement exercises, in which Achebe was scheduled to receive an honorary doctorate degree less than 24 hours before the event was to begin. Unbelievable. On the orders of Awolowo's cronies, who were in power in Western States of Lagos. He will go on to write, and I'm going to round up, he will go on to write his next book, The
Trouble with Nigeria.
His next book, Anthills of the Savannah. He will go on also to present a critique of Nigeria's political system, this time looking precisely on the corrupt military leadership. So in a way, we see one of the people then continued again in Anthills of the Savannah, where he will take on the corrupt leadership and dictatorship of post-war Nigeria. Let me conclude. Achebe did not spend all his writing criticizing and pointing out the flaws of Nigeria. He proffered solutions. He insisted on the responsibility of the people to hold their leaders accountable. He called for vigilance against mediocrity and for defense of merit. He held out hopes for the nation and for the people. Let me conclude in his own words, in his very last book, There Was a Country. He said, "I foresee the Nigerian solutions will come in stages. First, we have to nurture and strengthen our democratic institutions and strive for the freest and fairest elections possible. That will place the true candidates of the people in office. Under the rubric of a democracy, a free press can thrive and a strong justice system can flourish. The checks and balances we have spoken about and the laws needed to curb corruption will then naturally find a footing. A new patriotic consciousness has to be developed based on an awareness of the responsibility of the leaders to the led, on the sacredness of their anointment to lead, and disseminated by civil society, schools, and intellectuals. It is from this kind of environment that a leader, humbled by the trust placed upon him by the people, will emerge, willing to use the power given to him for the good of the people. End of quote. Thank you. Now, I don't know if we have time for questions. We are all here.
I would say let's let them have some question time because we're only a little bit behind at this point. So please, does anyone have a question for this panel?
Thank you, Patrick. Two very quick comments, and I mean really very quick. When we talk about governance in Africa, corruption, socio-economic inequality, and all the 9 yards, I've always sung a song. And that song goes like this. No, I'm not singing. That for those who try to analyze Africa in that regard, and it really doesn't matter where you have graduated, you could have been Harvard, Yale, and Sorbonne, or Oxford, whatever. You will always have a skewed analysis if you do not learn to make the distinction between African leadership and the people of Africa. What people do, what analysts do most of the time, is talk about the whole thing as if it is just one single entity. Whereas the African people are some of the hardest working. I'm not saying that because I'm African. Look at the books. They're some of the hardest working people that you can find on the face of this earth. They're smart as anybody else. They're as good as anybody else. But on the other hand, and that's what you just reminded us that Achebe was referring to. On the other hand, it's like God created the world and selected all the rotten leaders that he can find anywhere and put them on the continent of Africa. And last thing, Mohamed, and I do this very, very respectfully because I want to disagree, with your characterization of violent extremism. When you talk about Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, and then you refer to what happened in warfare, I think we're comparing apples and oranges. In the first one, these are pariahs. They operate outside the normal realm. They are not accepted by the society. The other one that you categorize as violent extremism, even though there are spades of violence, it's part of the culture. It is accepted. You understand? You don't, when you mutilate an Ogbanje, nobody ostracizes you. It is wrong. It may be wrong, but within the context of that culture, it is acceptable. In fact, people in the Kanuri area of Borno and so on and so forth, they do not accept what Boko Haram is doing. Better than anybody that Al-Shabaab is not accepted either in Somalia or in Kenya. And I'm talking about their activities. And that's why I say it may be a little bit erroneous to compare those two.
I can respond to that.
Yes.
Because I think I either misspoke or you misunderstood me, one of the two. Because actually I was referring to the concept of religious intolerance, where we have priests who preach to their people about people going to hell, just like we have preachers like Abu Bakr Shekau and Abu Drogo who preach the same to their people. When I was talking about the culture, I was talking about the motivation for some of the people to abandon the Igbo culture. Maybe there we did not communicate.
It gets better.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, what Professor Akamalafe said is very correct about, Achebe's understanding of making the distinction between the leaders and the people. But there is also something about him, which is that he's a very straightforward person. He calls it as he sees it, right? So, yes, the leaders are part of the problem, but there are somewhere in some of his writings where he also will point out the culpability of the problem from the people. Right, like people not holding the leaders accountable, or the elite in particular, the elite and in the intelligentsia, the civilian enablers of these corrupt leaders who sing their praises because they wanted contracts or because they wanted appointments. He will also point that out. But he would then insist that ultimately to fix the problem, the people will be re-educated, and then they recognize their rights, and then they stand up for their rights, and then they can demand of their leaders, responsibility and, being good leaders. So he did mention, but of course, he made it clear, though, that as a writer, he is on the side of the people. He's on the side of the oppressed at all times.
Thank you.
Can we take maybe one more question, and then we can, exit the stage for the next panel? Okay. No, the speaker, the microphone. Yeah.
This question is for Patrick. You don't have to go into details, but I'm just curious, you as an historian, what lens do you use to talk about the Biafra war? Do you use the ethnicity lens or social class lens?
What I use or what Chinua Achebe used?
What you use?
Oh, as an historian?
Yes.
I use all of them. As an historian, I look at the range of factors that led to the collapse of the Nigerian state, which then would lead to the civil war. After independence, by the time of independence, Nigeria was full of hope. I'm full of optimism. Great things, were happening. Universities were being built. People were excited. But then, of course, a whole bunch of other things will set in. Yes, we talk about corrupt politicians. We talk about challenges of nation building. And you can also will not remove the problems of neocolonialism. Kwame Nkrumah wrote extensively about that, right? The idea that, the corporate world that control the corporate, economy still wanted to continue to control this even in post-colonial countries. So you set the nations you set the nations on fire, pretty much. It's in the context of that we can actually add, what we call tribalism. Look, you cannot understand tribalism in isolation of challenges of underdevelopment in Africa, right? So that's where it comes in. So all of those are all included, right? And then, of course, the fabrics of the nation, broke down. Negotiations couldn't work. And then that's what eventually led to the Biafra. So the Biafra was a response to the collapse of the Nigerian state. It's not the Biafra that caused the Nigerian state to collapse. It's just responding to a state that collapsed, and then the war. Yeah.
Thank you, guys.
I hope we didn't take us too much time. Okay.